International Soccer Preview. We are Soccerphiles Canada. Welcome to our continuation of Series 19. This one looking at the players of the 2023 Asian Cup, due to be played in January 2024. This episode is looking at the players of Tajikistan. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and this is Series 19 on the players of the 2023 Asian Cup, played in 2024. And this episode covers Tajikistan's players. We're doing this mediacast in two parts. So part one is a look at the candidates for the squad and their likelihood of making it. We think we went into too much detail in previous player media casts we've done. So we're aiming for a lighter, more listener-friendly version this time. Part two will come out when the squad lists are released and the final squad is announced. We think that will be in late December. And at that time, we'll go back over the list that we've created today and see who made it and who didn't. And we'll cover a couple of other things, which I'll talk about at the end. We have made a separate video on what we'll be covering for the next 9 months, so I'll keep it short here. YouTube watchers can see the link to that video on the screen, and it can be found in the show notes for both watchers and listeners. In short, we're focused on the Asian and African Cups, with both of those taking place in early 2024. And we have also started coverage of World Cup 2026 qualifying. So this episode will have three sections. Section one, we will give some general information on the team and discuss a couple of kind of overarching points. Section two is the main part of the podcast where we look at the main candidates in each position. And in the past, we kind of touched on the unlikely or those who seem to be off the team. We're not going to do that this time. Rather, we'll bring them back up if they make the final squad, basically. And section three will give any closing thoughts and a preview of part two, which will come out in a couple of months. Okay, I kind of admit that this is a hokey substitute for a Tajikistan shirt. All I really have is the colors, and I had to use a Mexico shirt to get those colors. So I apologize. It's the poverty of international jerseys that I will try to rectify as time goes on. But Tajikistan, I'm sorry, at least I have your colors. I'm just going to pause for a little drink before I continue. Okay, done. All right, let's begin then. Moving on to section one, some general information on the squad. And Tajikistan, most positions are very stable for Tajikistan, with one player per position for the most part, or else it'll be a small stable of players who can interchange positions if one happens to be out. But basically, the positions are nailed down, and we can pretty easily predict who's going to be starting for them. I meant to put up a little graphic to support these points. So very stable in most positions. Next, a mad scramble. Well, in some positions, notably goalkeeper, central defense and forwards, there seemed to be a mad scramble to try out some new players over the two games in September and October. So this caused a bit of confusion because it led to some of the regulars not being called up for one or both of those games. We suspect that those players remain on the squad and are just giving way to try out a couple of new players, maybe in the case of players being injured, just having a few more options for them. So we don't think players not showing up for the last couple of games is a last-minute change by the manager, but rather just trying to create some substitutes and some options for themselves. Finally, the makeup of the squad. There are a smattering of players playing abroad. A lot of them play in Uzbekistan, and some of them play in Russia, but most of them play in Tajikistan. So we'll try to point out the ones that are not playing locally, especially if they're playing for kind of a bigger team. But if we don't mention the team they play for, it's likely that they are with a local club in Tajikistan. Okay, and the last part we'll comment on the squad is some retired players. So Tajikistan has never been to a big tournament, so even their most experienced players never played in a tournament. But a couple of them have gotten too old to play in this tournament. And one of them is Davron Ergashev, or sometimes called Davronzon Ergashev. He actually is still playing in Uzbekistan with a big club in Uzbekistan, Bunyodkor. For Tajikistan, he has 72 caps and 8 goals, but at 35 years old, a little old for this tournament. So he last appeared for the national team on the bench in June 2022. So I suppose there's an outside chance of him returning, but it seems quite unlikely. The other one is Fatkuloyev. I'm just going to darken the names, but actually the light gray indicates that they have never participated in a tournament. So that's going to be the case for all of the Tajikistan players until after this tournament, at least. Fatkuloyev has 71 caps, so almost the same as Ergashev there, and 10 goals, a similar record. He's only 33 years old, but he last appeared in 2019. So I think he actually might have officially retired from the squad, but is not to be expected at this tournament. Okay, next section is a look at their recent games. So we won't go into too much detail here. The major tournaments were the end of Asian Cup qualifying in June of 2022. So that was quite a long time ago now. 3 games in June of 2022, which successfully brought them to this Asian Cup. There were some friendlies in between that in September 22 and March 23, 2023. And in June of 2023 was the Kappa Cup. So that is their local cup, the Central Asian Football Association Cup, which took place in Uzbekistan. I think it was actually in 2 countries, but I have Tajikistan here. And then after that, they played a couple of friendlies, but actually just 1 friendly in September and 1 friendly in October. So not a lot of chance to build the team, and kind of understandable why they might be using those games to build a bit of depth into the squad. Okay, in terms of formations, that's quite stable too. It's almost always a 4-1-2-2-1. So 4 at the back is consistent. 2 central defenders and a right back and a left back. In the middle, kind of 1 more defensive midfielder. The next 2 will tend to be central midfielders, and the next 2 will be attacking midfielders or wingers. And finally, the 1 forward is a forward. So pretty consistent with that. Whether they lose that in the cup will remains to be seen. And the final part of this section deals with upcoming games. So actually November has the start of World Cup qualifying, actually the second round. There was a preliminary round of games in October, and we actually started our World Cup 2026 coverage by looking at those. And they end up playing one of those teams who graduated from that preliminary round here. So on November 15th, they play Jordan, so a bit of a tough game there. And then on November 20th, they play Pakistan. That was the team that progressed from the preliminary round. Actually, a bit of a surprise win over Cambodia there. Cambodia was favored, but Pakistan made it through. So we can expect Tajikistan to be fielding their best players for that, not too much experimentation. Maybe against Pakistan, they can afford to experiment a little bit, and we may get a glimpse of their Asian Cup squad through those games. So we may do an update podcast. Closer to the tournament, in which case we would talk about who they use there. Now we move on to section 2. I'm going to separate the words section and part, because part 2 will actually be the video that we put out later on once the final squads come out. So here we go. We begin with the manager. That is Petar Surgut. I'm not really sure how to say the name. Petar Surgut. I don't think repeating it is really going to help me. Anyway, he is a Croatian, and he played professionally from 1984 to 1993, but he was forced to stop playing at 27 years old due to a knee injury, actually a second knee injury, so moved into management instead. He's actually managed a number of kind of smaller teams. In addition to club teams, he has managed the Georgia national team and the Afghanistan national team, Maldives, and now Tajikistan. Maldives he was with for 4 years before this. So quite experienced as an international manager, although, as you can tell by the light grey of his name, he has never actually been in a tournament before. So that is Peter Surgut, and I suppose we would consider him a definite candidate because they probably wouldn't change managers at this late stage. Let's move on to goalkeepers, and I'll begin just by introducing the names and the likelihood, and then we'll go back and build a bit of a narrative about the situation there. So we start with Rustam Yatinov. Rustam Yatinov is a likely candidate, and so is Mukradeen Kasanov. A likely candidate. We'll talk about who the starter is expected to be. And finally, Dalar Baratov. All three of those likely, and I suspect that the three who will be at the Cup. But we do have a couple of other candidates at the possible level. The first one is Sarfamad Gafarov. The second is Sukrab Hudza Yusupov, and finally Sokruk Kyrgyzboev. Three keepers at the possible level. So let's go back and talk about them and start building a narrative. So the first one, Rustam Yatimov, actually we were going to put him as a definite because he started 14 of their 16 games, all the games from March until the beginning of September, but then he wasn't selected for the last two matches. So does that mean that the manager has done a 180 and doesn't favor him anymore? We'll have to see. The second one, Mukradeen Kasanov, only has one cap for the national team, and that came in one of those 16 games that we've just talked about. He was subbed in for one of those. He was on the bench for 11, though, and so he looks like a likely candidate to us, Mukradeen Kasanov. However, Dalar Baratov is got his first appearance on the bench in March 2022, and he started the last two games there, replacing Rustam Yatimov, and but wasn't selected for quite a few games. He was under military service, doing military service for 9 games, so he was away there. So he was started in the last two games, so we consider him likely as well. The other players, the three possible ones, beginning with Sarfamad Gafarov, got his first appearance on the bench in June 2022 and didn't start any. The two we mentioned started all the games. But he was on the bench for 6 games, including the last 2 games. So kind of brought in at the end here. And we don't know if that means it looks like the manager is at least considering some of the goalies here. Shokrov Kyrgyzboev didn't start any of the games either, but he was on the bench for 6 of them and not selected for 6 others. So he was kind of in there, but he too was not selected for the last 6 matches. And finally, Yusupov, the last one, got his first and only appearance on the bench in October 2023, so brought in right at the end. But when players are brought in like that, it's hard to know whether the manager is seriously considering them or not. So we would have him as possible, but unlikely. But it was the last game that he played. So the story here is that we think Rustam Yatimov not appearing in the last 2 games or not being selected was just to make room to try out a couple of other keepers. And that he's not really being reconsidered. It would be fairly late in the game to remove him from the squad. So we still consider Rustam Yatimov the starter, but a bit confusing since he wasn't selected for the last 2 games. So 3 likely candidates and 3 possible candidates there. All of these players are quite young, 25 years or younger. And all of them play in Tajikistan. So we won't talk about clubs unless there's something outstanding. But the first 2, Yatimov and Kasanov, both play for Istiklal, which is the biggest club in Tajikistan. So in these smaller countries, it's usually the players who play for the biggest clubs that make up a large part of the national team. Anyway, all of these guys playing in Tajikistan. Okay, moving on to defenders. We have 2 definite candidates, and we're talking about central defenders here. 2 definite candidates in Zwar Zuraboev and in Baghdad Kanonov. And then we have 1 likely candidate in Mekrubon Karimov. And then 3 likely candidates, 3 possible candidates in Shiyuvush Asrorov, Kolmurod Nazarov, and Sodikjon Kurbanov. So let's go over these players. We do actually have 4 possible but unlikely candidates here, but we're not going to get into those in this podcast. We also have 1 who seems to be off the squad now, although he just retired, or he last appeared in 2022. But again, we'll bring those ones back in if they show up on the final roster. So let's go back to the top and talk about Zwar Juraboev. So he actually plays in Uzbekistan. He's been with the team since 2016 with 29 caps, but he is only 25 years old. And he started 15 of their 16 games over the last 2 years and was on the bench for 1 other. So we consider him a definite candidate. And that's kind of what I mean by the players being very stable. Baghdad Kanonov also we consider definite. He started 13 of their 16 games over the past 2 years and was on the bench for 2, just 1 match that he was not selected for. Generally is a central defender, but did play as a right back in the last 2 games in September and October there. And he's probably with the biggest club amongst all the Tajikistan players. He's with Persepolis in Iran. So that is one of the top clubs, not only in Iran, but in Asia. So Baghdad Kananov, many reasons why he would be a definite candidate and a starter as well. The likely candidate is Mekrubon Karimov, and he got his first appearance in March of 2022, and he didn't start any of the remaining game or any of the 15 games that were played since that start, but he was subbed in for 4 and on the bench for 8. So he seems to be consistently called up, though very much a substitute and not a starter. He wasn't selected for the last game either. So again, a bit of a confusing spanner in the works there as to whether the manager is considering other players ahead of him. Amongst the 3 likely candidates, Shiovush Asrarov is 29 years old and has been with the team since 2013. He has 46 caps, and he returned after an almost 3-year absence and started 3 of their remaining 14 games. But he was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 6. The only thing is he was not selected for the last 3 matches, so maybe the manager is reconsidering him. And Kolmorod Nazanov, also a possible candidate. Maybe I won't go into the details as much. He did start 2 of their last 5 games and was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1. So he is being called up and is maybe ahead of Azarov in the pecking order there. And finally, Sodik John Kurbanov. He's an under-23 player. He's just 20 years old and got his first appearance in June of 2023. I see I have one more possible candidate, and that is Alidzon, it's a long name here, Karamatulazoda. Also a possible candidate. So we do have 2 likely starters there, and we have Karimov as a likely substitute, but we know they bring 5 or 6 players to the party here, and I think Nazarov is one of the more likely among the possible candidates there. And Kurbanov probably a little lower down on the pecking order. Okay, and then as I mentioned, there are 4 possible but unlikely players to choose from, and it's never a shock to see those players brought in at the end. 3 of those players, their first appearance was on the bench in October, and so they could be in the manager's plans. Okay, let's move on to left backs. Yeah, again, with goalies and with central defenders, they seem to be trying out a bunch of new players right at the end here. That's not going to be the same for all the positions. I think we see it with forwards too. But in these positions, like left back, it's pretty steady. So we only have 2 likely candidates here, and it's Akhtam Nazarov. So a bit confusing because some of the players, there's more than one player of that name. Tabrizi Islamov, I believe we'll see another Islamov a bit later on too. So Akhtam Nazarov is a real veteran with the team since 2011 with 75 caps and 5 goals, and he started 12 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, subbed in for 1 and on the bench. But again, we had to move him down from definite to likely because he missed the last 2 matches. So this is becoming a pattern, and we don't think the manager is necessarily kicking all of these players off the squad, but instead maybe making room to just try out a few players. By the way, Akhtam Nazarov is the captain of the team. The other likely candidate is Tabrizi Islamov, and he started 6 of their 16 games, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for one. And not selected for 8 others. However, 6 of those 8 that he missed were the first of the 16 matches in the last 2 years. So basically, over the last year or over the most recent period, he's been called up regularly, which is why we have him as a likely candidate. He's much younger at 25 years old. And that's all we have actually for candidates here. However, there is one player we'll meet later who's coded as a left midfielder, which is Dalar Imam Nazarov. And he has played at left back before, but he's just a substitute. So we don't think he'll really challenge for the position. Again, teams usually bring 2 or 3 players for this position. If there are 3 players, one of them is probably a bit more versatile. Okay, moving on to right backs. It's an even more steady or an even more predictable situation, because there's really a definite candidate, and then there's 2 right backs, but they both seem to be off the squad. So really just one candidate here, and it is Manuchek Safarov. So Manuchek Safarov has been with the team since 2019, but already has 27 caps, even though he's just 22 years old. And he plays for one of the bigger clubs on the squad, Lokomotiv Tashkent in Uzbekistan. He also played for Persepolis in Iran. So these are relatively good resumes for the Tajikistan players. And Manuchek Safarov started 14 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, and was on the bench for one, and was with the under-21 team for one other. So there seems little doubt that he will be the starting right back. However, he did play left back in the game in September. But otherwise, he is a steady right back. Again, 2 candidates who seem to be off the squad that we'll only talk about if they appear on the final squad. So that is it for defense. Really, you know, we think that the goalkeeper who started all of the games until September will be the starting keeper. And you know, even the central defenders and the right back and left back are almost sure bets to be the starters. All right, let's move on to the midfield, and we begin with defensive midfielders. There's really not a lot of difference between the defensive and the central midfielders, other than the fact that the players are kind of coded that way. So actually, the one who's been playing most defensively, Amirbek Juraboev, who we have as a definite candidate, is actually coded primarily as a central midfielder and secondarily as a defensive midfielder, but he always seems to be in that defensive role. So he has been with the team, Amirbek Juraboev, since 2014 and has 51 caps. And he plays actually his club soccer in Malaysia, having joined from a team in the Philippines over the last a couple of years, so has moved over to East Asia there. We also have a possible candidate in Muradali Aknazarov. Muradali Aknazarov first appeared in November 22 and has not started any games, but he was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 3. So he seems a fairly likely candidate, but he's sub when he comes on, and almost comically, his substitute appearances are always 3 minutes or less so far anyway. But he does make a kind of a backup candidate for Juraboev, who will almost certainly be a starter. Moving on to players coded as central midfielders, and keeping in mind that the midfield formation is usually 1 at the back and then 2 players who are usually central midfielders, and then 2 players who are usually coded as wingers or attacking midfielders. So these guys are kind of in the middle there, but I would say probably more on the defensive side. The first one is Esoni Panishambi. He is a likely candidate, Esoni Panshambi, and probably Tajikistan people are cringing at my pronunciations here. And we also have I actually put him as the likely candidate, but we do have a definite candidate, so I should move him ahead, and that's Parvizdon Umar Bayev. A definite candidate. And we also have a possible candidate in Ruslan Kaloev. A brand new player to the squad. And we'll just talk about these 3 a little bit. Beginning with the definite candidate, Parvizdon Umarbayev. And he has been with Tajikistan since 2015 and has 41 caps and 8 goals. And he plays his club soccer in Bulgaria, primarily with Lokomotiv Plovdiv. I believe that's one of the bigger teams in Bulgaria. He was with them for 6 years and recently moved, I believe, to a smaller club in Bulgaria. As far as the national team goes for Tajikistan, he started 12 of their 16 games over the last 2 years and was subbed in for 1 and not selected for 3 others. So we consider him a definite candidate, even though he missed 3 games. He actually scored 4 of their 16 goals in qualifying and was the top scorer for his team, despite being coded as a defensive midfielder and lining up as a central midfielder. The likely candidate, Esoni Panishambi, is started 13 of their 15 games over the last 2 years, subbed in for 1. So almost an identical record to Umar Bayev, but we moved him down a notch because he also missed the last 2 matches. So another kind of stalwart starter for Tajikistan, but a bit of doubt thrown in because of missing the last 2 matches. But I'm pretty sure these players will make their return. Finally, Ruslan Kaloev, as I said, is a brand new player. Got his first cap in October there of 2023. So he actually did play as a starter in that game in October. And he is with Tyumen in Russia. I must confess that club name is not one that I know. So it's a pretty small club in Russia. And Kaloev is 20 years old. And here too, we do have one player who seems to be off the squad, who we won't talk about unless he returns. Okay, left midfielders. Now, I want you to imagine the 4-2-2-2-1 formation. Sorry, that should be 4-1-2-2-2-1. So there is kind of a defensive midfielder and then 2 central midfielders. It doesn't really leave room for left midfielders and right midfielders. And we don't have many players coded in those positions. We only have 1, and that's the player I mentioned before, Dalar Imam Nazarov. We have him as a possible candidate. Just excuse me while I take a drink here. So we don't actually know much about Imam Nazarev because he's only had 6 caps, and I believe they were all as a substitute. and we're not even sure if he's a left midfielder or a left back, because I think he's played both positions. So got his first appearance on the bench in June 2022, didn't start any of their remaining 13 games, but was subbed in for 6 and on the bench for 4. So he looks like a pretty steady selection as a substitute, just not as a starter. So Daler Imnom Nazarev, a possible player. For right midfielders, though, we don't have any candidates in that position. And so we're going to move directly to left wingers. And again, there's not a lot of distinction between left wingers and left attacking midfielders. So you might think of these players in the kind of top left quadrant of the field. Might be a good way to imagine them. The position bleeds into attacking midfielders. So our first left winger is Vasidin Safarov. So that's another player named Safarov, and we have him as a possible candidate. And here I will mention a player who is possible but unlikely, and his name is Khusray Toyrov. Khusray Toyrov, and I'll tell you why I'm adding his name to the list here after I talk about Vasidin Safarov. So Safarov got his first cap in September of 2022. September of 2023, and he started one of the last 2 games there and was subbed in for the others. So another late arrival who they are maybe building their squad with. We have him as a possible candidate. The possible but unlikely candidate, Khusrav Torov. I mentioned him because he is a 19-year-old player who is with Shakhtar Donetsk in Ukraine. So Shakhtar Donetsk is a pretty big club there in Eastern Europe, and a Champions League kind of club. However, for Tajikistan, he hasn't really made his way. He first actually appeared a long time ago in May 2021. But over the past 2 years, didn't start any of their 16 games. He was just subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 2. So he's basically still playing with the underage squads, the under 20 and now the under 23 team. And again, yeah, but may make it to the squad because that's a pretty good club affiliation. On the right wing, for right wingers, we have a definite candidate, and that is Muhammadson. Muhammad. Tajikistan players often have a zon at the end of their name, so it's really, and sometimes it's not added. So it could be Muhammad Rakimov or Muhammad Zon Rakimov. And he's a veteran on the team since 2016 with 47 caps and 2 goals, even though he's just 25 years old. He plays in Uzbekistan with Bukhsoro in Uzbekistan, and he has started 11 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 1. So just 1 time was not selected. So we expect to see Muhammad Rakhimov on the field as a starter, actually. And here we do have one possible but unlikely candidate, also named Safarov, and the retired player that we talked about at the beginning, Faktuloyev, who is off the team. But we won't put them on the list here. All right, and that covers the midfield, because we look at attacking midfielders as part of the forward line. So we do have attacking midfielders who will tend to be kind of more central midfielders rather than kind of wingers or left or right attacking midfielders. The first 2 are likely candidates: Alisher Zalilov and Shervoni Mabatshoev, both likely candidates. And then we have three possible candidates. The first one is Alisher Shukurov. The second one is Abu Bakr Suleimanov. And the third one is Alidzoni Aini. Alidzoni Aini. So let's go back over those and go back to Alisher Zalilov. He's actually been drifting off the team, so we have him as a likely candidate, but he's kind of falling to the level of a possible candidate. So I'm anxious to see in November whether he makes the squad. He started 5 of their 16 games over the last couple of years, was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 1. But then he was injured for 4 matches. Not selected for 4 matches, including the last 2. So in this case, it may be that not being selected for the last 2 matches does mean he's drifting off the team there, because he's been kind of playing less and less of a role for the team. Nevertheless, Alisher Zalilov we still have as a likely candidate. Shervani Mabatshoev started 10 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, subbed in for 2 and was on the bench for 2. So we would have had him as a definite candidate, but he, again, following that pattern, was not selected for the last 2 matches. So again, we don't really think that means much. And actually on the list here, I'm going to move him above Zalilov because he definitely seems a stronger candidate. There, but again, that missing the last 2 games, throwing in a bit of doubt there. But it could be that he was making room for some of the possible candidates we have here, because 2 of them are brand new to the squad. So Alisher Shukurov got his first cap in October 2023, and he started that game. So whether it means he's making inroads or whether they're just trying out a player to have more options to choose from. The same is true with, or not quite the same, Abu Bakr Suleimanov got his first cap in September 2023. So he started that game in September, but then was on the bench for the one in October. So again, this looks like just trying players out. Finally, Alidzoni Aini is a less likely candidate. He started 2 of their 16 games from March 2022 to October 2023. So that's the 2-year period we're looking at over the last 2 years. He was also subbed in for 4 and on the bench for 3. However, he was not selected for 6 others, and I think some of those were towards the end. So yes, the last 3 games he was not selected for. So maybe a bit lower down on the possible list. But really, with those players coming in so late, it's very hard to say whether they're serious considerations or not. Okay, let's move on to secondary strikers, and we have a likely candidate in Komron Tursunov. And yeah, just 2 players who seem to be off the team who we won't mention. So Komron Tursunov has been with the team since 2018 and 27 caps and a pretty good 6 goals there. And he plays his club soccer in India, and he has for a long time, since 2019, having been in Tajikistan from 2015 to 2019. He only started 1 of their 15 games, though, over the last 2 years, but he was subbed in for 5 and on the bench for 2. And not selected for 8 others. So given that we put him as a likely candidate, I'm thinking that many of those 8 matches were at the beginning of that 2-year period. However, he wasn't selected for the last match either. But I have a note here saying he was always a substitute, as we can see, but called up for about 2/3 of the recent games. So We have Konrad Tursunov as a likely candidate, and maybe we bumped him up to likely because there's a bit of a lack of players in these positions. So that raises their chances. Now, the big story on Tajikistan is forward Manucheka Zalilov. Manucheka Zalilov is probably the most important player on the team. I'm going to put him as a definite candidate, but there's a big question mark. So, excuse me, I'm just going to cough. Okay, so he is their main scorer. He has been on the team since 2011 and has a very respectable 51 caps and 20 goals. So scoring at a 40% rate there. Very important to the team. He was their top scorer in World Cup qualifying in 2018 and 2022, and for the Asian Cup qualifying in 2019. But I must say, actually, Tajikistan has a good variety of scorers on the field. So they're not completely dependent on Manucheka Zalilov, but he is very important. He started 12 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, and he wasn't selected for 4 others, including the last 2. However, in his case, the reason he wasn't there for the last 2 games is because he reportedly was in hospital in Moscow with a serious injury. He doesn't play in Moscow. He's with Istiklal in Tajikistan, so probably they're they have 2 big teams, and Istiklal is one of them. I'm just trying to think of the name of the other. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So, you know, he was actually maybe brought to the hospital there in Moscow with a serious illness, in quotation marks, according to the source I had, and he hasn't shown up for the last 2 games. So depending on what that is, he could be absent for the cup because it could be a longer term injury. So that would be a huge loss for Tajikistan. And meanwhile, we're going to see that some of the, I said mad scramble at the beginning, a bit of a mad scramble to find replacements for him. Although, you know, they do have forwards to choose from, but whoever there is going to replace him in a starting position. So we have 2 likely candidates in Sharon Samiev and also in Nuruddin Kamrokulov. 2 likely candidates, and then 2 possible candidates in Muhammad Ali Azizboev and Rostam Soyrov. So one of those who have probably been a substitute up till now, as you'll see shortly, will have to move into the starting position. So let's see. The first one, Sharon Samayev, started just 2 of their 16 games, but was subbed in for 7 games besides. So that's why we have him as a likely candidate. He was injured for 2 and with the other under-23 team for 4 others. So it looks like when he's available, he's invariably called up, but only as a substitute. He actually plays in Moldova and was in Belarus before that, and played for Rubin Kazan in Russia, which is a pretty big club, in 2019 and 20. But just a substitute for Tajikistan, unless he's the one who moves into the starting position. But it looks like Nuruddin Kamrokulov might be the guy, because he too had only started 2 of their 16 games over the last 2 years, and was a subbing in for 8 and on the bench for 3. But the 2 games he started were in September and October. Just in September. So they were obviously trying him out in the role. Nuruddin Kamrokulov. Anyway, whether they're substitutes or starters, those two players are very likely to be called up. And we'll look at the possible candidates: Mahmoud Ali, Aziz, Boev. We almost put him as a likely level, but will be a substitute. He got his first appearance in June 2023 and didn't start any of the remaining 5 games, but was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 3 others. So looks like they're calling him up regularly. The other one, not so likely, Rostam Soyrov. He started the last game, so he replaced Zalilov in the last game. He was subbed in for 3 and on the bench for 2. However, there were 6 matches that he wasn't selected for. And he actually hadn't appeared all through 2023 until he suddenly came back into the squad for the October game to replace Zalilov. So that's why I said he was a little less likely. But again, a sudden appearance, especially as a starter like that, makes us a bit unsure of where he stands with the squad. Okay, and then we do have 3 other names. One of them is possible but unlikely, and 2 of them have been off the squad. And we won't put them on the list here, but we will come back and review if they make the squad. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the kind of the listing of candidates and their likelihood. So we are going to finish with some closing thoughts, and really I'll just repeat what I said. It looks like a very stable squad, and we think most of the ones who were not selected for the last match or the last 2 matches will be on the squad, and they're just being left off the squad in order for the manager to try out some new players and possibly build the squad. Okay, now let's preview what we're going to do in part 2. So we will go over the list, and not only will we tell you who made the final squad and who made the preliminary squad, if there is one, but we will try to predict who the starters will be, which is actually a bit easier for Tajikistan than it is for other squad. But there's always a few of these notable non-selections, so players who we expected to be there who were not selected. Some surprise inclusions that may be, for example, those retired players may suddenly come back, or a player who's been off the squad, like the forward we talked about right at the end there, Soyrov, who seemed to be off the squad and then suddenly appear as a starter. There's always a couple of those. Any new players who are called up, so that's quite possible, because a lot of players are coming from their under-23 team, and we saw a lot of new players just pop up in September here. So more pop up, and then updates on injuries, especially important, is whether Manuchek or Zalilov will be fit to play in this cup. I'm sure that's at the top of the minds of all Tajikistan soccer fans. All right, well, that brings us to the end, and we will come back with part 2. Bye-bye. We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We'd like to thank Naber Avacham and Pixabay for the wonderful music you hear in this mediacast. The title is called Arabic Trap.